I stumbled across a really cool technology recently, and it's called Ionic Capacitor. As I mentioned in my first video, my journey as a software engineer, I spent the better part of 10 years making Android apps using Java. One of the things that I really wanted to learn how to do though was to create cross-platform mobile applications that can run on iOS and Android with a single code base. Ionic Capacitor allows me to do just that. Write my code once using JavaScript and it'll be able to run on iOS, Android, web, and even desktop. So you might be asking yourself, what is Ionic Capacitor? It is an open source, native runtime for building progressive web apps. You can think of it as a cross-platform native bridge that allows you to turn any web project into a native iOS or Android mobile application. Since this is all written in JavaScript, you can choose to build your app using any of the top JS frameworks, whether it's React, Angular, or Vue. In this video, I want to take you along on the journey that I had while developing my first app using Capacitor and React. The best way to get started learning any new language or new technology is to just jump right into it with a simple project. The project that I decided to create using this new framework is a simple game that is very similar to the color memory game Simon. The main difference being instead of memorizing color patterns, you'll have to memorize a sequence of white squares. Let's walk through a quick illustration together to better understand this concept. The game board starts out as a grid of 3x3 black squares. After about a second, a pattern of random white squares is displayed. This pattern is shown for about 2 seconds, and then the board returns back to all black squares. Your task is to replicate that pattern of white squares that was just shown by clicking them on the screen. If you are successful in recreating the pattern, then another pattern is generated and shown in sequence after the previous pattern. Each time you are successful in recreating the sequence of patterns, a new pattern is generated, and your job is to recreate the sequence of patterns in the order in which they were shown. The game is over as soon as you enter an incorrect pattern. So the framework that I chose to use was react.js because I already have a few years of experience with it. However, I'm not going to explain in great detail how React works in this video. Also, let me pull a full disclaimer here because I haven't actually used React in a few years, so I'm a bit rusty. So feel free to leave comments suggesting any code improvements if you notice that I do something dumb. Okay, with that out of the way, let's jump right into the code. The first function of importance in the home component is the render function. This is the React lifecycle function that re-renders the components to the screen. That's just a fancy way of saying that it refreshes the screen with an updated version of this component. It gets triggered whenever setState gets called. Also, you'll notice that this is where I call all of the 9 square components that receive properties related to the state of the game board. The second function of importance in the home component is the one called component_did_mount. This is one of the React lifecycle functions that gets called after render. This function calls the displayNewBoard function inside of a set interval loop. The main purpose of displayNewBoard is to generate the sequence of patterns and update the state object so that the screen displays the new patterns. Inside of this function, I also make a call to check user input, convert indexes to click lists, and update board state. After displayNewBoard is called, it instantly makes a call to check user input. In this function, I compare the squares that have been clicked with the state variable, all patterns, to check if the user has clicked a correct square or not. Depending on if it was correct, it will either end the game or trigger the loop for the game to generate a new pattern by setting the variable isIntervalRunning to true. The final function of importance in the home component is onClickMe. This function gets passed to the square component as a function pointer and gets triggered each time the user clicks a square. The purpose of this function is to update the state variable called clickedList so that the home component always knows which buttons are currently selected on the screen. Notice how this function calls setState. This triggers both the home and square components to re-render. Now let's take a look at the square component. This component only has 2 functions, render and update GUI. This component pretty much just draws the squares to the screen and sets their color to either black or white depending on the values that it sees from the properties that are passed to it. After many long hours of fixing weird bugs, I was finally able to get the application to behave as expected. After installing, downloading, and setting up the Ionic dependencies on my laptop, I was able to create and run the project for web and Android with relative ease. But the hard part came when I was trying to make it run on my Mac so that I could get the iOS build to work. This required me to update my Mac OS and iOS on my iPhone. First, I tried to run the starter code in the Xcode IDE, but I was unsuccessful. Apparently, I needed to get the latest version of Xcode installed. After trying to update Xcode, the App Store seemed to have a problem because the install progress bar got stuck for hours. After a bit of searching online for a solution, I read that I needed to update my Mac OS first before being able to update Xcode. However, I ran into another problem trying to update to the latest version of Mac OS. It said that the storage on the disk was full even though I could see that it had at least 25 gigabytes of free space, and that the OS update only needed 20 gigabytes. So I decided to format that hard drive and completely factory reset my Mac. Once that was completed, I was able to get the latest version of Mac OS. Then I tried installing Xcode again, but I was getting the same issue with the App Store, the progress bar getting stuck and never finishing. Finally, I was able to find an alternative solution for installing Xcode from the developer website. After getting the Mac software all up to date, I then installed the latest version of iOS on my iPhone, and then I could finally see the code run and the application working. I plan on playing with this framework a lot more in the future and making more exciting projects with it to learn how it works. Feel free to download this project from my GitHub and modify it as you see fit. I'm thinking about adding a multiplayer mode that allows you to play online against friends and compare scores. Comment down below if you think that'll be cool to add. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. Peace.